Continuing on in the book of Galatians, where we talk about how to live free. Paul wrote a letter to the Galatian churches, and the Galatians were a group of people who had at one time had carved themselves out a little nation out of land that was given to them that did not belong to the guy who gave it to him. It's an interesting history. If you get a chance, go home and Google it. The history is really, really fascinating. But a king was dealing with a civil war in his area. He invited the Gauls to come up, and he said, if you come help me, I will give you this land. Well, the only problem is he didn't actually own the land, but the Gauls liked the land so much they went in and conquered it themselves, and for a little while, they remained free. Rome came in, conquered them, and made them a part of the Roman Empire, and it kind of chaffed the Gauls. The Gauls saw themselves as a people who loved to be free. Now, it kind of has a sort of a mindset of the way we think of ourselves as Americans. As 4th of July's come around, we always see ourselves as a people who live free. Maybe that's just me, I don't know. The reality is, though, is as they lived free, Rome took them over, and they felt like they no longer lived free. On top of that, Paul begins to deal with this idea, and he came in, and as he was preaching, he began to preach, you can live free. It doesn't matter who conquers your land. It doesn't matter where you're at. We as individuals can be free. You can be free of guilt. You can be free of trying to strive to please gods that are fickle. You can be free from the shame of striving, and he says you can live free. And this message of freedom took off amongst the Gauls. As soon as Paul would leave a town and a little group of people would start and they would begin to gather together and they were talking about Jesus who set them free, another group of people, and there were actually two different groups. There were a group known as Judaizers, and then there was a group known as the Gnostics who came in behind him. And right where Paul left off, they said, yeah, Paul taught you some good stuff, but he forgot to tell you everything. And in top of what Paul taught them, they began to add rules and regulations. They began to say, you've got to follow certain rites and rituals. You've got to add to, if you're going to please God, there's all these other things you must do. And by the time Paul writes the book of Galatians, if you read the book of Galatians and the intent and the way Paul is writing it, he is writing it and he is, I hate to use the word angry, but he is highly frustrated. And the book of Galatians does not write with a lot of Paul's normal tones where greetings and how wonderful you guys are doing. In fact, he writes with a slightly different tone as frustration. I can't believe you guys are doing this. How can you give up freedom for something that is going to enslave you all over again? And so we've been talking about over the last couple weeks, and Paul begins to deal several times, and we've looked at this, that there's only freedom found when we give our life to Jesus Christ, that there is nothing we can do to gain God's favor. He's given us his favor. He's loved us, and if we simply trust in him, he will forgive us. Paul's not fully done with this idea yet, and as we hit into Galatians chapter 4, Paul's beginning to deal with an idea that pulls us even deeper in. And to help us fully understand this, he's going to go into a topic, I'm just going to put it this way. He's going to be dealing with the idea of adoption. Now, some of the hardest and the most beautiful stories that I know of are stories on adoption. For any of you who've been out there who have ever been a part of adoption, maybe you have been adopted, maybe you have had a friend who's adopted someone, maybe you've tried to go through the story of adoption. The story of adoption is one of the hardest stories to deal with, as well as one of the greatest, most beautiful stories that we can deal with. It always starts, and it usually starts with a set of parents, a set of parents who find themselves in a difficult situation where they cannot, for some reason, take care of their own child. When that time happens, a child is put up into a system, and for those of you who've ever been a part of it, it's a hard system. You get into the government system, and at first try to be fostered out, and because the whole goal is that most people desire that a child should be able to get back with their main parents, and that should always be our goal. And when that does not work out, a child goes up for adoption, and for a parent to adopt, they have to be able to have a certain amount of excess love and a desire to reach in and to be able to do something that says we choose to go through a process that is both excruciating on the parent and sometimes for the child who is being adopted. But it's a story where you see people by choice jump through hurdles and go through excruciating pain in order to love somebody who needs to be loved. What I love about the story of adoption is that a story of adoptions are stories of love, purpose, and a future. Now, as great as adoption stories are to us, when Paul writes the book of Galatians, he writes the story of adoption in a slightly different way. There's some similarities, but there's some differences that are huge that we do not fully understand today. The story of adoption in a Roman culture was extremely different and even more powerful. For those of you who'd like to, we're going to explore this just probably a little bit more on Tuesday night. But to kind of give you a basic, each of the cultures that Paul was working, you see, as Paul was going through the Roman Empire, he was not dealing with a monolithic Roman culture. Paul was going through the Roman Empire, and as Rome conquered cultures, there were Greeks, there were Gauls, there were people from all over the empire that each had their distinct individual customs. However, Rome kind of had a blanket that everyone understood, basically how Rome understood this idea of adoption. If a wealthy individual ended up at a spot in life where he did not see himself to have an heir, now he may have children, but if he did not deem himself to have an heir that was worthy of his name, he had an option to look into his home and see if he had a slave who he admired more than his own children. He could look out of his family and see that there's a poor young family over across the street and they got 10 children and they've got an exceptional young guy in there, and he could go do a deal with the family and say, "Can I adopt your child?" And in the case is that most of the families had, sometimes if they had multiples, they were willing to go, "Yeah, we'll do a deal with you. You can adopt our child and we don't have to feed another one." But he could take that child in, whether it was a slave, whether it was a child of a slave, whether it was a poor child down the street whom he decided had the attributes of the family he wanted. And he would go through a process that he would adopt that child. And in the moment that he adopted that child, and by the way, that child could be 45 years old. There is no age requirement. It's a moment of saying, do you go through this process with us? And the moment that that adoption takes place, that child's past, his history, is seen to be no more, because he now has a new past and a new history, which is whose? The guy who just adopted him. The moment he was adopted, he was seen to be full rights, full history, full, culture, customs, didn't matter where he came from. It was now who adopted him. You were a slave. You are not a slave. You are the master of this household. There was a second form of adoptions that they understood, and this is if Now, if a dad had sons, and predominantly only happened with sons, occasionally it happened with daughters, but it was very rare. Most of the time it only happened with sons, as a dad would come in and at a time of his choosing, usually between the ages of 14 and 16, he would look at his son and say, "You are now becoming an adult. You are no longer a child, that I want to adopt you." You say, "What do you mean?" It's his son. Sort of. When a dad and a mom gave birth in the Roman household, especially in a wealthy household, when that child was born, he would take that child and he would hand it over to servants, slaves of his household, to raise that child for them. As he took that child and handed him over, that child was simply had more value in a sense, but it ran under the same rules as all the other slaves. In fact, it was almost for a time in his life worse than the slaves, because guess who the child had to obey? He had to obey the slaves. As the father handed his child over to the slaves to raise, that child, in a sense, became a child of the slaves. Now, there was a day coming that when a child got to about 14 or 15, and as the dad is looking out and he's seeing the maturity of that child, and yes, he's becoming a fine young man. I mean, he's got a full beard now. He's looking good. That somewhere around between the ages of 14 through 16, he would look at that child and he would say this: "I think it's time." And in a moment, overnight, he would take that child in, and it was a process, and I believe they called it the toga virilis or something like this, that he would stop and he would place a toga on him that he did not have the right to wear before, and the moment he put that garment on, he was deemed to be adopted and no longer a child and someone who had to listen to and obey the slaves of the household, but a master. Overnight, his position changed from one who was under the slaves to one who was deemed to be over the slaves. He had become adopted by the Father with the rights and the privileges as an heir of the family. Adoption in the day of Paul was extremely important. As Paul wrote to the Galatian churches, he was writing to them as someone who understood the process or the idea of what it meant between being a slave and being free. Now, I want to be very clear. As we talk about freedom, the idea of freedom had many different layers to it. So I want you to hold in mind real quickly the story of adoption, of how they saw adoption, and then as you're looking at it, how do you see freedom? How does a slave view freedom? You see, there's this idea that free did not necessarily mean free. A slave, if he was fortunate enough, if he could in some way save up enough money somehow, if he could somehow sneak out of the house at the right time of the day, whatever, and could manage to get to a different country, he could be free. There was an idea that if a slave could run away and run fast enough and hard enough and get to a different place, he could become free. The only problem is what? At any moment, if he got caught, he was imprisoned, he was beaten, because Rome did not take kindly to their slaves freeing, and they wanted to make sure there was a punishment that scared slaves from running away. He had the right to be punished. In fact, he had the right that when the master came, the master could, in many instances, put his slave to death if he ran away. He was not really free. There were times, though, when a master could say, you have served me well, I have appreciated all you've done for me for the last 20 years, that I will set you free. And he could stop and he could write a letter that the slave that could carry with him, so that if someone came along and says, aren't you a slave of so-and-so, he could pull out a letter that states, no, I have been set free. The problem is that to simply be set free was not really freedom. If you were a slave who had served a family for all of your life and you were set free and yet you had no financial security, no way to make an income, what did you do? You see, there was a problem with slaves who had nothing. You were still in a spot where they would find themselves going and literally selling themselves back into slavery. And there were times when slaves would go to a master and would say, Master, you have been so good to us over the years. I voluntarily give you my service for the rest of my life. And they would do it through a process where they would sometimes take him to a doorpost, and they would take an awl, and he would stick his ear up to the doorpost, and they would drive an awl through his ear to indicate that he had willingly given himself to his masters to serve, because everyone understood that a slave being set free without financial security is not free. So when Paul begins to talk about adoption and freedom, he's looking at it from a perspective of, here, I want you to think about it like this. There is a person who has been a slave all his life, and the master looks out and says, I do not want you to be a slave. I want you to be an heir. I don't want you to worry about having to please me. I want you to have the rights and the privileges of someone who is over the household. Now, real quickly as we discuss this, be very clear and understand the intention of what Paul is saying. As Paul is talking about adoption and slavery, he is not trying to say that there are people who are worth more than other people. Remember, we looked at this last week. Paul makes it very clear in Galatians chapter 3, verse 28. He makes it very clear where he says, there is no longer Jew or Gentile, slave or free, male and female, for you all are one in Christ Jesus. Instead, what Paul is trying to declare, and that we all know is true, is that there is a legal difference in the eyes of the law based upon position. The slave knew and understood it didn't matter how smart he was, the law would never recognize him as the master. It didn't matter how foolish and how ignorant and how much a master relied upon his servant to keep his household in order. The law was never going to take it away and give it to his slave. What Paul is dealing with is an idea of position. Who are you? So when Paul begins to write to the Galatian church and this idea of freedom, he's trying to get across that there is a moment when God did not just, in a sense, go, yes, I forgive you, or I will, you can run away from everything, but there's going to come a time when, your sins are going to catch up with you. But Paul is saying there's a time when God showed his favor to you so much he loved you that he gave you the option to be his child or his heir. In Galatians chapter 4, verses 4 through 7, Paul writes this. Now, when the right time has come, or had come, God sent his son, born of a woman, subject to the law. God sent him to buy freedom for us who were slaves to the law so that he could adopt us as his very own children. And because we are his children, God has sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, prompting us to call out, Abba, Father. Now, you are no longer slave, but God's own child. And since you are his child, God has made you his heir. Paul is reminding them that when they chose to follow Jesus Christ, God did not just simply say, okay, I will wipe away those things, the debt that you owe, but he bestowed something upon us that sets us free. He makes us a child with an heir, or an heir. An heir cannot gain the favor of his father. An heir has the favor of his father. An heir does not have to earn the rights and privileges of a son. The heir has the rights and privileges of a son or a daughter. Paul is trying to remind them there is no longer a need to gain God's favor. You don't have to work to please him. You already have been forgiven if you choose it. Paul is trying to help the Galatian church to understand it's not what you do, it's who you are. Kind of to help us understand a little bit in what we understand today, if you are a parent who has had children, you know there's times when your children may invite the neighborhood kids around to your house. Now, as a good person who loves their child, you open up your house and you open up your doors, and your child comes in with their friends, and they come in and they raid your fridge and they tear through the house, they watch your TV, they play in the pool, and as a good parent, you allow it. Yet only one child has the right to be there. Only one child, if he messes up, stays there. What happens to the other child? When you cannot take any more, and you get on the call, you get on the phone and you say, hey, so-and-so's here. I'm sending them home now. Or you open the door and say, all right, Sally, all right, Bob, time to go home. Your mom is, she's got dinner cooked for you. Time to go home. Now, your child does what? Okay, maybe you send them home with the other kid too. Only one child has the right to stay. Only one child has the right to inherit and has the right in your home. We understand that. That's because our children are our heir. We do not punish another person's child. They're not ours. We do not bestow the same love on another person's child because they're not ours. We love and we care for, from a distance. But your child has the rights and the responsibilities of your home. The idea that Paul is trying to help them understand, they're not just forgiven. They're not just a slave that has had the door opened up and say, you are now set free. But they have become a child with the rights and the privileges of a child. We do not have to gain God's favor. Favor has been bestowed on us. Not because of how good we have been, but because of the position He has given us. We maybe will look at this. If you remember the story Jesus gave of the prodigal son, does anyone remember the story? A dad had two sons. One went wild and lived and did some horrendous things. The other stayed home. There came a time when that son came back. And when you read the story of it, it is dealing with this process. As in that moment when the son came home, the dad did something for him. It's actually the story of adoption. He takes off his signet ring, slides it onto his son. He takes off and puts a brand new coat on him and says, my son was lost, but now he is found. It is the story of adoption. He has come home and has all the rights of a son. Not because of what he had done, but because of who he was. Look, we're going to go ahead and get ready to close. But can I just say this? When you hear the story of adoption, when you go through, when you know of somebody who's going through this process and you see the pain and you see the struggling of what it goes through, can I just say this? Can you stop and in the back of your mind remind yourself that this is the story of what God went through for us? The story of the cross, the story of the resurrection, the story of what He did to forgive or to redeem us from the consequences of where we were going, is the story of adoption. It is a story of being loved by choice and being given a future. If you've given your life to Jesus Christ, Paul makes it clear, Jesus tells us that the past has been forgiven and the future has been secured. You do not need to gain God's favor. You have been given God's favor. Okay, this week we're going to do something. We're not going to call you to do anything or be anything, but I do want you to go through this week, and I want a certain process or a certain thought begin to kind of just rumble in your mind a little bit. What does your position look like for you? Now, next week we're going to talk about what is the responsibility of an heir, because there's a freedom from something, but we're also told there's a freedom for something. And we're going to look at that more next week. But for this week, I want to kind of, as you go through this week and as you find yourself dealing with a situation, I just kind of want to ask yourself, what does God's favor look like in this situation? So when you make a mistake this week, and by the way, you will make a mistake this week. I'm just going to, okay, I know you guys are going to be shocked by me telling you this, but you will make a mistake sometime this week, probably next hour or less. And as you do, I just want you to kind of think in your mind, as you stop and you're dealing with, where does God's favor allow me to be? What does it do for my life? In the middle of the mistake that I found myself in, what does that favor look like? What does it mean to be loved? Not to gain love, but to be loved. Now, it should cause us to go many different directions. It should cause us to be secure and say, okay, I am loved. That mistake is in the past. Let's move forward. But it should also cause me to say, what does it mean to be loved? Should I keep doing that mistake, or should I look at doing something different? What does favor cause you to do? How does it cause you to act? What does it mean about your past? What does it mean about your future? As a slave child who would be adopted, did not have the past of a slave. This is the crazy thing. He may have lived as a slave all the way till the time he was 45 years old, but the moment that he was adopted, he was never deemed to have been a slave. He was deemed to have taken on the family history of the family he just became adopted to. I think that's powerful. What does your future look like if you have a position that is secured? What does your past look like if you have a position that is secured? Not gaining favor, but having found favor. Dear Heavenly Father, as we get ready to close,